She walked into the WNBA carrying the weight of an entire sport on her shoulders. Sold-out arenas, record television contracts, charter flights for veterans who had never experienced that luxury before her arrival. Caitlyn Clark did not just change women's basketball, she rescued it from financial obscurity and transformed it into a cultural phenomenon that the entire world was watching. But here is the brutal truth that nobody in the league's front office wants to say out loud. The same institution she elevated is now systematically destroying her. From being deliberately excluded from the Olympic roster to being physically targeted on the court while officials looked the other way. From veterans who treated her like an unwelcome intruder to a commissioner who stood before national cameras and essentially told the world that the hatred directed at Clark was nothing more than a convenient marketing opportunity. Now the unthinkable is happening. The woman who single-handedly saved the WNBA is reportedly walking away. Not from basketball, not from competition, but from a league that never truly embraced the revolution she started. What you are about to read is the full story, and it is far more devastating than anyone is willing to admit. Before we can fully appreciate the magnitude of what the WNBA stands to lose, we need to revisit what Caitlyn Clark actually brought to women's professional basketball when she arrived. The Indiana Fever drafted her as the #1 overall pick, and almost immediately, something extraordinary began happening across the entire landscape of the sport. Arenas that had previously struggled to fill half their seats were suddenly selling out weeks in advance. Ticket prices that used to hover around affordable ranges for casual fans were being scalped at figures that rivaled NBA playoff games. Television networks that had previously given WNBA broadcasts minimal promotional attention were now dedicating primetime slots and marketing budgets to games featuring Clark and the Indiana Fever. The numbers are not subjective, they are not a matter of opinion or interpretation, they are cold, hard, documented facts. League-wide attendance surged by more than 40% following her debut season. The WNBA secured a landmark media rights agreement valued at over $2 billion, a figure that would have been unimaginable just a few years prior. Television viewership tripled across multiple broadcasting partners who had carried the league for years without ever seeing anything close to those kinds of audience numbers. Jersey sales reached historic highs, with Clark's number 22 becoming one of the best-selling sports jerseys in the entire country, across all leagues and all genders. She did not just become a star. She became the story of American sports in a way that transcended the boundaries of women's basketball and entered mainstream cultural conversation. People who had never watched a single WNBA game in their lives were suddenly tuning in every week just to watch Clark play. Casual sports fans, families with young daughters, college basketball enthusiasts who followed her extraordinary career at Iowa. Demographics that the league had spent decades unsuccessfully trying to reach were suddenly showing up in massive numbers. All of that happened because of one player. One player who was then systematically mistreated, physically targeted, publicly undermined, and ultimately pushed to the point where insiders are now reporting that she is seriously reconsidering her future commitments to both the Indiana Fever and the national team. If that is not the most spectacular act of institutional self-destruction in modern sports history, it is difficult to imagine what would qualify. To understand the full scope of the crisis the WNBA now finds itself in, you have to start at the very beginning of where things went catastrophically wrong. And that beginning is the decision to exclude Caitlyn Clark from the United States Olympic roster for the Paris Games. When the selection committee announced the team that would represent America in Paris, Clark's name was conspicuously absent. The justification offered was one of experience and team chemistry. The committee argued that the veteran core of players had established a winning system over many years together, and that integrating a rookie, regardless of her individual talent, would disrupt the cohesion necessary to compete for a gold medal on the world's biggest stage. On the surface, if you accept those stated reasons at complete face value and refuse to look any deeper, the argument has a degree of surface-level plausibility. Olympic competition is uniquely demanding. Chemistry between players matters enormously. Experience at the international level can be the difference between gold and silver. But nobody who watched Caitlyn Clark play during her debut WNBA season genuinely believed that the decision was purely about basketball. The evidence that something else was driving the decision emerged most clearly during the WNBA All-Star Game, where Clark and a team of other WNBA players faced off against the Olympic squad in what became one of the most revealing exhibitions of basketball talent that the league had ever hosted. Clark was electric. She was hitting shots from distances that left even veteran defenders shaking their heads. Her court vision and passing ability put her teammates in positions to succeed that the Olympic team simply could not replicate with their more methodical and deliberate style of play. The team that supposedly lacked the chemistry to compete with the Olympic veterans dominated that game in a way that made the selection committee's reasoning look not just questionable, but completely disconnected from basketball reality. What became impossible to ignore after that game was the uncomfortable truth that several observers had been whispering about since the roster was first announced. The decision to exclude Clark was not primarily about basketball fit. It was about ego. It was about established players protecting their legacies, their spotlight, and their grip on a sport they had controlled for years. It was about a closed circle of veterans who had no interest in sharing their moment with someone whose presence would inevitably mean that all eyes would be on her rather than on them. The message the selection process sent to Clark was unmistakable. You may be the most marketable athlete in the history of this league. You may be breaking records and filling arenas and generating billions of dollars in new revenue, but you are still not one of us. And until we decide that you have paid sufficient dues on our terms, you will remain on the outside looking in. For a young player who grew up idolizing those very veterans, who spoke in interview after interview about her admiration for Diana Taurasi and Sue Bird and the generation of players who built the league before her arrival, that rejection must have landed with devastating force. If the Olympic exclusion represented the first major wound inflicted on Clark by the establishment she had tried so hard to join, what happened to her on the court once the WNBA season began represented something far more disturbing. From the opening weeks of the season, it became apparent to anyone watching closely that Clark was being subjected to a level of physical targeting that went well beyond anything that could be legitimately characterized as aggressive but acceptable professional basketball. The incidents were not isolated. They were not random. They formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore once you were paying attention to it. The most widely discussed incident involved Chennedy Carter, whose blindside hip check sent Clark crashing to the floor before she had even received the ball. The hit was flagrant. It was premeditated. It had nothing to do with competing for position or contesting a shot or any other legitimate basketball action. It was simply a physical assault disguised in the context of a sporting event. But Carter's hit, as egregious as it was not unique. Throughout the season, Clark absorbed physical punishment that went unpenalized or was penalized with laughably insufficient consequences. She was the recipient of shoves, hard fouls, face-guarding tactics designed to intimidate rather than defend, and the kind of sustained physical pressure that officials in a league claiming to prioritize player safety should have been flagging and penalizing aggressively from the very first incident. The officials' failure to protect Clark was striking. Fouls that would have been called immediately on behalf of veteran players were either ignored or graded as common fouls when directed at Clark. The league's process for reviewing flagrant fouls and escalating penalties moved with a slowness that was only corrected after public outrage became too loud and too widespread for the league to continue pretending there was no systemic problem. And throughout all of it, the commissioner was silent. Kathy Engelbert, the leader of the organization charged with protecting all of its players and maintaining the integrity of competition, offered no meaningful public statement defending Clark while the targeting was at its most intense. She did not call out the behavior. She did not make clear that the league would not tolerate what everyone watching could see happening. She simply allowed the situation to deteriorate week after week while a young woman who had done nothing wrong except become enormously popular was being made to pay a physical price for that popularity. For Clark, who handled the situation with remarkable professionalism throughout, never lashing back, never publicly calling out her aggressors, never positioning herself as a victim even when she clearly was one, the league's silence must have communicated something damaging and lasting about her status within the organization. She was generating the revenue. She was filling the arenas. She was creating the television ratings that funded the charter flights and the improved salaries that everyone else was benefiting from. And when she needed protection, the institution she was single-handedly saving chose to look the other way. If there was a single moment that may have pushed Clark from frustration toward genuine disillusionment, most observers who have been following this situation closely point to Kathy Engelbert's appearance on CNBC and the interview that followed. In what can only be described as one of the most tone-deaf public relations performances by a major sports executive in recent memory, Engelbert was given the opportunity to directly address the toxic atmosphere that had been swirling around Clark throughout the season. She had the platform, the audience, and the moment to make a clear, unequivocal statement that the WNBA does not tolerate racism, does not tolerate sexism, does not tolerate the kind of targeted hatred that had been directed at Clark from multiple directions simultaneously. Instead, she chose to frame the entire situation as a marketing opportunity. Engelbert drew comparisons to the rivalry between Magic Johnson and Larry Bird in the 1980s NBA, a period that is celebrated in basketball history for revitalizing a struggling league through the intensity of competition and the personal dynamic between two transcendent players. Her argument seemed to be that the conflict and controversy surrounding Clark was analogous to that historical moment, something that, while intense, was ultimately good for business and representative of the sport's growth and popularity. The comparison was not just analytically flawed, it was morally bankrupt. The Magic and Bird rivalry was fierce and competitive and occasionally heated, but it did not involve one player being deliberately subjected to racist commentary, sexist attacks, orchestrated social media harassment campaigns, or the kind of physical targeting on the court that Clark had endured. The conflicts of that era were basketball conflicts. What Clark was experiencing was something fundamentally different, and pretending otherwise was an insult to her experience and to the intelligence of every person watching. By choosing to contextualize the hatred as a business metric, rather than condemning it as unacceptable behavior that the league would actively work to eliminate, Engelbert sent a message to Clark that was crystal clear even if it was never stated explicitly. The league sees your suffering as useful. Your pain is a ratings driver. Your discomfort is a storyline that keeps people engaged and watching. As long as people are paying attention, we're not particularly concerned about what you are going through. The WNBA Players Association, which typically maintains a carefully managed relationship with league management, was sufficiently disturbed by Engelbert's comments that they felt compelled to release a statement publicly distancing themselves from the commissioner's characterization of the situation. Individual players, including Nafisa Collier and Breena Stewart, stepped up to explicitly condemn racism in sports, something the commissioner of the league had declined to do when handed the perfect opportunity. When your own players' union has to correct the narrative that the commissioner just made worse, you have had a catastrophically bad week in executive leadership. And for Clark, watching all of it unfold from the inside must have been an experience that fundamentally changed how she views her relationship with this league and this institution. To fully understand what Clark walked into when she was drafted by the Indiana Fever, it helps to understand the culture of the league she was entering. The WNBA has, for much of its history, operated as a relatively tight-knit community of players who have built careers together over many years, often through significant personal and professional sacrifice in a league that has historically underpaid its athletes and provided far fewer of the amenities and resources that male professional athletes take for granted. There is genuine solidarity in that community. There is real shared struggle. And there is also, inevitably, a degree of protectiveness over that shared identity that can curdle into something less admirable when challenged by an outsider whose arrival immediately shifts the entire spotlight in her direction. Clark represented something that made certain veterans deeply uncomfortable, and not entirely without understandable reasons. She arrived as a phenomenon. She arrived as the story. She arrived in a way that implicitly suggested that everything that had come before her, every record set, every season played, every sacrifice made, was a prologue to her story rather than a story worth telling in its own right. That dynamic would create tension in almost any professional environment. But in the specific context of the WNBA, where veterans had fought so hard for so long to build something meaningful, it created a particular kind of resentment that expressed itself in damaging ways. The whispers that circulated before the Olympic roster was announced, that veteran players had expressed reluctance about allowing the Clark circus to disrupt their Paris preparations, were revealing not just because of what they said about the Olympic selection process, but because of what they revealed about how Clark was perceived by the establishment she was trying to join. She was not seen as a teammate, she was not seen as an asset to be welcomed and developed. She was seen as a disruption, a spectacle, something that needed to be managed and contained rather than embraced and celebrated. Sheryl Swoopes, a genuine WNBA legend whose career accomplishments are beyond dispute, became one of the most prominent voices in this dynamic. Her commentary about Clark throughout the season ranged from dismissive to factually inaccurate, including a particularly embarrassing moment when she incorrectly stated that Clark had played 5 years in college, a basic factual error about one of the most covered athletes in recent sports history that suggested the criticism was being driven by something other than careful analysis. The league's decision to continue platforming Swoopes as a commentator and analyst while she was actively and repeatedly undermining the credibility of their most valuable asset sent another unmistakable message to Clark. The old guard's comfort with you matters less to us than their comfort with each other. In any other professional environment, that kind of public misrepresentation of a colleague's record by a senior figure would prompt serious institutional pushback. In the WNBA, it was apparently just considered content. The WNBA All-Star Game became one of the most unintentionally revealing moments in the league's history, and it significantly accelerated the narrative surrounding Clark's future intentions. When Clark and her fellow WNBA players squared off against the Olympic team, the stated justification for her exclusion from the Paris squad was put to the test in the most direct possible way. The committee had argued that Clark's playing style, characterized by high usage, deep shooting range, and a fast-paced offensive tempo, was fundamentally incompatible with the veteran Olympic team's more deliberate and systematic approach. What actually happened on the court in that game shredded that argument completely. Clark was brilliant. She was commanding the game in ways that made her team look significantly more dynamic and dangerous than the squad that had been assembled to win Olympic gold. Her passing was creating opportunities. Her shooting was stretching defenses in ways that opened up the interior. Her instincts and court vision were operating at a level that made any serious basketball observer question why the selection committee had decided that this player could not possibly contribute to an international team competing for a gold medal. The game confirmed what many had suspected all along. The chemistry argument was a convenient cover story. The real issue was never whether Clark could play within a team system. The real issue was whether the established veterans were willing to share the stage with someone whose presence would inevitably mean that she would be the center of the story, the face of the team, and the name that every camera would be tracking whenever she had the ball. They were not willing. And rather than acknowledging that reality honestly, the selection committee constructed a basketball rationale that simply did not hold up to scrutiny once you watched Clark play in precisely the kind of team context they claimed she could not operate within. The aftermath of that game changed something in the public conversation about Clark's future. If the chemistry excuse had collapsed completely, and if the political motivations behind her exclusion were now impossible to credibly deny, then the question naturally arose: why would she want to continue subjecting herself to a system that was working this actively against her interests? One of the most striking and uncomfortable ironies embedded in this entire situation is the financial dimension of what Clark's presence has meant for every single player in the league, including the very veterans who participated in or tolerated the culture that pushed her toward the exit. Before Clark's arrival, the WNBA was a league defined by financial struggle. Players were routinely underpaid relative to their athletic talent and competitive achievement. Travel conditions were often inadequate, with commercial flights being the norm for road trips that their NBA counterparts would have handled on private charters. The league's media rights were valued at a fraction of what comparable men's leagues commanded, and sponsorship money was difficult to attract in significant quantities. The transformation that followed Clark's draft selection was not incremental. It was dramatic and immediate. The league signed media rights agreements that dwarfed anything previously negotiated in its history. Attendance figures that had stagnated for years suddenly began climbing at rates that surprised even optimistic league executives. Charter flights, which had been a luxury beyond the league's financial reach for most of its history, became accessible because the revenue being generated by Clark's popularity made them financially viable. Every player in the league benefited materially from what Clark brought: higher salaries, better travel, more visibility, more sponsorship opportunities, greater media attention. A collective bargaining negotiation position strengthened enormously by the league's improved financial standing. And the players who benefited most from those improvements, including veterans who actively participated in or silently endorsed the culture that targeted Clark, never fully reckoned with the contradiction embedded in their own behavior. They wanted the private planes. They wanted the improved contracts. They wanted the elevated platform and the mainstream visibility. They simply did not want to fully acknowledge where all of that was coming from or treat its source with the respect and protection she had earned. You cannot simultaneously build your financial future on the foundation someone else constructed while treating that person as an unwelcome outsider. That contradiction was always going to create a reckoning, and that reckoning appears to be arriving now. No discussion of the cultural dynamics surrounding Clark's experience in the WNBA would be complete without addressing the Angel Reese situation, which represents one of the most glaring examples of the league's failure to manage the environment it was creating. The rivalry between Reese and Clark originated in college basketball during the national championship game and carried a genuine competitive intensity that was legitimate and interesting and worth celebrating as the kind of competition that elevates sports. When both players entered the professional ranks, there was enormous excitement about what their continued rivalry might mean for the league and for women's basketball's cultural profile. But the league's management of that rivalry was deeply irresponsible. Rather than channeling the competitive dynamic between these two players into a marketing and storytelling framework that elevated both of them, the league allowed the rivalry to metastasize into something uglier. When Reese celebrated her teammates' hit on Clark in ways that many observers found troubling, the league's response was insufficient. When social media commentary around both players took on dimensions that went beyond basketball competition into personal attack and genuine harassment, the league's institutional response was largely absent. Clark, for her part, consistently took the high road. She declined to engage with trash talk. She refused to publicly characterize herself as a victim. She stayed focused on basketball and let her performance speak for itself, but maintaining that professionalism while being subjected to sustained targeting from multiple directions simultaneously extracts a personal and emotional cost that compounds over time. The league's failure to manage the environment around this rivalry, its apparent comfort with allowing toxic narratives to flourish as long as they were generating clicks and engagement, was another dimension of the institutional failure that has driven Clark to the point where she is now reportedly reconsidering her future commitments. In the midst of all the financial analysis and institutional critique, it is essential to step back and acknowledge what is actually being discussed here at its most fundamental human level. Clark herself addressed this in an emotional public statement that was striking precisely because she is someone who has maintained remarkable composure throughout everything she has endured. She spoke about being human, about having a family, about having 2 children, her own loved ones, who were devastated by the comments directed at her. She described it as having been a tough week in a manner that suggested it was one of many tough weeks in a season defined by them. That is not just an athlete discussing her professional challenges. That is a person describing the experience of being subjected to sustained public hatred while an institution that profits enormously from her presence declines to offer meaningful protection. There's a version of this story that the WNBA's front office seems to have believed, that Clark would be grateful enough for the opportunity to be in the league that she would absorb whatever came her direction without complaint or consequence, that she would smile for the cameras and express appreciation for being allowed to participate in something larger than herself. That the rookie would play by the unwritten rules of the established order and wait for permission to fully claim the space she had already demonstrably earned. That version of events has collapsed completely. Clark understands her value. She understands what her presence means financially to the league and to every player in it. She understands that the institution needs her considerably more than she needs the institution. And she has apparently reached a point where she is no longer willing to accept the terms of a relationship that asks her to generate transformational revenue while being treated as a second-class participant within the very ecosystem she is sustaining. The practical consequences of Clark choosing to withdraw her participation from the national team program and potentially reconsidering her long-term relationship with the Indiana Fever are difficult to overstate. The 2028 Los Angeles Olympics represent what should be the greatest showcase moment in the history of American women's basketball. The games will be held on home soil. The audience will be enormous. The opportunity to introduce the sport to millions of new fans who might not have followed it previously is genuinely historic. But that opportunity is entirely built on the assumption that Caitlyn Clark will be the face of Team USA when those games begin. She is the player whose image belongs on the promotional materials. She is the name that drives casual fans to actually tune in and watch. She is the phenomenon that transforms a well-played basketball game into a cultural moment that transcends sport. Without her, the 2028 Olympics still features excellent basketball. It features accomplished, dedicated, elite athletes competing at the highest level. But it does not have the crossover appeal and mainstream cultural magnetism that converts a sporting event into a phenomenon. And that difference matters enormously for the long-term trajectory of the league. Beyond the Olympics, Clark's withdrawal from national team commitments would send a signal throughout the sports world that is impossible to spin positively. The story would write itself. The WNBA treated its greatest star so poorly that she chose to walk away from representing her country. That narrative, once established, would be extraordinarily difficult to counteract. And the business implications for the collective bargaining agreement negotiations would be immediate. Players are currently pushing for better compensation and improved conditions based substantially on the revenue growth that Clark's presence has generated. That leverage evaporates if the player responsible for generating those numbers is disengaged or absent from the program entirely. The question that ultimately matters most at this stage is not how we got here, though understanding that history is essential. The question is whether the path toward reconciliation is still open and what it would require to walk it. The honest answer is that reconciliation is possible but would require a quality of institutional self-reflection and accountability that the WNBA has not yet demonstrated any capacity for. It would begin with Commissioner Engelbert issuing a public statement that actually addresses what happened, not a carefully worded corporate non-apology that acknowledges vague concerns while protecting everyone from accountability, but a genuine recognition that the league failed Clark in specific, identifiable ways, failed to protect her from physical targeting in a timely manner, failed to create an environment where her presence was welcomed rather than resented, failed to use the platform available to unequivocally condemn the racism and sexism directed at her throughout the season. It would require honest conversations between Clark's representation and the league about what structural changes are necessary to ensure that what happened this season never happens again. Not promises, not platitudes, concrete policy changes with accountability mechanisms attached. It would require the veteran core of the league to engage in some difficult conversations about their own role in creating and sustaining the culture that made Clark feel like an outsider in an institution she was financing with her popularity. None of that is easy. All of it is necessary, and the window for making it happen is not unlimited. Caitlyn Clark came into the WNBA not asking for special treatment. She came in ready to work, ready to compete, and genuinely excited to be part of something she had dreamed about her entire life. What she received in return was exclusion, physical targeting, institutional silence, and ultimately a commissioner who told the world that her suffering was a profitable storyline. The WNBA has spent years searching for its breakthrough moment, the star, the story, the cultural phenomenon that would carry women's basketball into the mainstream consciousness permanently and powerfully. That breakthrough arrived in the form of number 22 from Iowa, and the league responded by making her feel unwelcome in every way imaginable. Now they face the very real possibility of watching her walk away. The golden ticket that arrived in Indiana is being torn in half not by Clark's ambition or her unwillingness to pay dues, but by the pettiness, jealousy, and institutional cowardice of the people who were supposed to protect and celebrate her. History will not be kind to those who let this happen. The only question remaining is whether anyone in the league has the courage and the wisdom to stop it before it becomes irreversible. The clock is running, and unlike a basketball game, this one has no overtime. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss our latest sports coverage and breaking analysis.